September 1st, 1483. The Tower of London casts a long, foreboding shadow across the Thames. Inside its cold stone walls, a silent drama unfolds, far from the public eye. This is no ordinary imprisonment. It is the confinement of a young princess. Elizabeth of York, eldest sister to the uncrowned Edward V, lives in gilded captivity, her destiny inextricably linked to the volatile politics of a usurped throne. In a few minutes, her fate will be sealed, a silent sacrifice in a cruel game of power that will change the course of England's history. How did such a young woman become a pawn in medieval ambition at its most brutal? To understand Elizabeth's tragic end, we must return to 5th-10th century England when the kingdom lived under the shadow of civil war. Elizabeth was born on February 11th, 1466, at Westminster Palace, daughter of Edward IV of England and Elizabeth Woodville. She was the royal couple's eldest child, a princess born in dark times that would mark her entire existence. Her father, Edward IV, was known for his charisma and military prowess, but also for the instability of his reign. Constantly threatened by the Lancastrian faction and internal rebellions. During his rule, the kingdom was often plunged into conflict, governed by factions vying for control, while the true succession remained precarious. Elizabeth's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was an equally controversial figure. Ambitious and fiercely protective of her children, she took advantage of her husband's favor to elevate her family and accumulate wealth. Chroniclers of the time described her as a woman who used her influence to secure advantageous marriages for many relatives. For Elizabeth Woodville, her daughters were valuable commodities in the European political game, destined to seal alliances through arranged marriages. Young Elizabeth grew up in this turbulent and surrounded by palace intrigues and political instability. England was torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, by conflicts between Yorkists and Lancastrians, and by the constant threat of usurpation. For a sensitive child, witnessing her father's struggles and her mother's calculating determination created traumas that would accompany her throughout her life. In 1483, when Elizabeth was only 17 years old, a political earthquake erupted that would change her destiny forever. Edward IV died unexpectedly, leaving behind a young heir, Edward V, and a power vacuum. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the late king's youngest brother, seized the opportunity. He moved swiftly to secure control of the young king and his siblings, isolating them in the Tower of London under the guise of protection. For Gloucester, it was an irresistible opportunity to claim the throne with the elimination of the legitimate heirs. The machinations lasted months and were conducted with the coldness of political maneuvering. Gloucester's agents spread rumors about the illegitimacy of Edward IV's marriage and his children, systematically undermining the Woodville family's standing. Elizabeth's age, considered old enough to potentially marry and produce heirs, was a subject of grave concern to the usurper. Some of Gloucester's loyalists argued it would be best to secure Elizabeth's marriage to a trusted ally, but Richard was ruthless. He faced internal dissent, the potential for foreign intervention, and the constant threat of a legitimate heir emerging. Eliminating the children of Edward IV was more important than considerations about their future. In June 1483, the terms were finally settled. Elizabeth of York, along with her siblings, was declared illegitimate, a princess sacrificed on the altar of royal ambition. Elizabeth's confinement in the Tower, though initially with her mother and younger sisters, became increasingly isolated. Richard, now crowned Richard III, saw the children as a continuous threat. While Elizabeth Woodville raged outside the Tower, protesting the injustice, Elizabeth remained in her silent prison, a pawn in a game she could not control. The young princess did not fully understand the depth of the danger. For her, the Tower was a temporary residence, perhaps a protective measure. She took with her only a few personal effects, her prayer books, and the hope of eventual release. The small retinue that accompanied her initially dwindled, leaving her and her sisters largely at the mercy of their uncle's increasingly paranoid regime. Life within the Tower for Elizabeth was initially one of uneasy. Richard III, to his credit, outwardly maintained a veneer of protecting the royal children, providing them with necessities and ensuring they were treated with a degree of dignity. Elizabeth received her own apartments within the Tower, though her movements were restricted and her communication with the outside world severely curtailed. But the princess's fragile sense of security was brutally shattered. By late 1483, her younger brothers, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, had vanished. Elizabeth, at 17, became a silent witness to a horror she could not openly acknowledge. The disappearance of her brothers created a terrifying dilemma for Elizabeth. She was a legitimate claimant to the throne, but her position was precarious, and she had no means of escape. Worse still, Richard III, having removed her brothers, now turned his attention to her. The new English king initially kept Elizabeth in close custody, hoping to use her in future negotiations or to secure his own position through a forced marriage. The young princess was kept in uncomfortable captivity within the Tower, where she spent months fighting for her own safety. Her desperate pleas to her mother, conveyed through clandestine channels, reveal a girl who had matured prematurely through suffering. "I fear for my life," she might have thought, "for I am kept here like a prisoner, far from all I love, without hope of justice." Her peril was absolute. In 1484, after subtle diplomatic negotiations conducted by her mother, Elizabeth's situation shifted. She was released from the Tower and forced to live under Richard III's watchful eye, eventually under an agreement that would see her marry a commoner or even his own son, Edward of Middleham, as a means of control. But the girl who had entered the Tower as a princess had transformed into an 18-year-old, prematurely aged by traumatic experiences. The release did not bring the expected happiness. England continued plunged in uncertainty, and her family received her more as a political pawn than as a beloved daughter. Elizabeth's tragedy, however, was far from over. In 1485, at 19, she was again used as political currency when Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant, defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. This time, however, Elizabeth achieved something that had been denied her in childhood, a marriage that brought an end to the brutal civil war. Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, was pragmatic and recognized the unifying power of marrying the leading Yorkist princess. The couple found a fragile peace in uniting the warring houses of York and Lancaster, a union that flourished despite the political circumstances. Elizabeth finally experienced what it was to be valued for herself, not just for her lineage as a negotiating piece. But happiness was short-lived. In 1492, her young cousin, Perkin Warbeck, claiming to be her brother Richard, Duke of York, emerged as a pretender to the throne. Elizabeth was caught in the crossfire, her loyalties questioned, and her past a constant shadow. She lived discreetly at the English court, dedicating herself to her children and the arts. Her experience as a survivor of royal machinations had given her a unique perspective on politics and diplomacy, knowledge she used discreetly to advise her husband. In 1503, Elizabeth gave birth to her seventh child, Catherine, a daughter who would grow up in a more stable England. Motherhood brought her some consolation, but also the bitter irony of knowing that her own daughters, despite a more secure lineage, would still face the pressures of royal marriage. Elizabeth of York died in 1503 at 37 years old from complications after childbirth. Her life had been entirely dominated by others' political needs. Imprisoned at 17 during her brother's disappearance, betrayed at 17 by her uncle, and used at 19 as a political pawn in a forced marriage. Her death, though publicly mourned, was a quiet end for a woman who had endured such turmoil. Elizabeth of York had fulfilled her role as a queen, generating heirs and sealing alliances. But her personal life was forever overshadowed by the tragic fate of her brothers and the trauma of her youth. Elizabeth's story raises profound questions about the role of women in medieval politics and the human price of royal ambition. Her experience illustrates how children, especially girls of nobility, were treated as transferable properties between kingdoms, their lives entirely subordinated to the political interests of their parents and husbands. More than 500 years later, Elizabeth of York's silent suffering continues to resonate as a somber reminder. The horrors of usurpation and the objectification of royalty for political purposes. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how entire societies can normalize the sacrifice of innocence in the name of greater interests. The princess who witnessed her brother's disappearance never truly had a peaceful adolescence. From age 17, she carried the weight of a fractured succession that should have belonged to adults. Her life was a continuous struggle against the currents of medieval politics, a price paid for temporary stability between warring factions. Elizabeth of York remains an eternal symbol of childhood vulnerability before uncontrolled political power. Her memory reminds us that behind each succession crisis, each royal claim, and each political marriage in history, there frequently existed children whose lives were destroyed to satisfy the powerful's ambitions. The girl who lost her brothers paid the supreme price for the Tudor dynasty, her own peace, and ultimately her family's unity.